This is CBC Toronto News.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's news on CBC Radio. Today, we'll be discussing a big change in society back in the 1920s. How the way women were treated in Canada has changed since the beginning of World War I. To discuss this problem, we have invited several guests over. Now on to Pedro, who's going to talk about jobs.
The way that the women were treated before the war was unrighteous. Practically, all of them needed to stay home to serve their husbands and act like housewives. Men would go to work in factories while the women would stay home cleaning, cooking, and taking care of their children. The First World War impacted women in tremendous ways, specifically when it came to women at the world of war. Whether it was in the ammunition factories or the coal mine, they proved themselves capable of handling this type of work. As said, many women worked at factories helping in the production of ammo and clothes for their soldiers in the front line, and others work overseas as nurses and ambulance drivers. Besides women owning this right of working, conditions were poor and the work was arduous. Though women often earned more than they had before the war, workers in munition factories were still paid as little as half the wages of the men doing similar jobs. If we talk in numbers, they used to be paid close to $2, while men used to earn more than double of their salary. Other issue was the factory work was often monotonous. Women often found themselves doing jobs that had been simplified into a series of unskilled tasks. And also, the job had no certain time of ending or starting. So many women working on those fabrics had to submit to more than 14 hours of rough work, not knowing what time they were going to get home. And that's when we start to brainstorm and think, was it really a right, or were they just doing it because they had to sustain their households and feed their children? The war ended in 1918. For some women, this offered new opportunities. But for the biggest part of them, it meant that they would have to go back home and be housewives again. And what established this was the 1919 Restoration of Pre-War Practices Act that forced most women to leave their wartime roles as men came back and factories switched to peacetime production.
Thank you, Pedro. Now on to Leo, who's going to talk about industries.
During the First World War and the Second World War, most of the men in Canada left their civilian jobs for their country. The jobs they had left behind needed to be filled, and in the First World War in particular, women without second thoughts stepped up forward to meet the surging demands of workers in a greatly expanding Canadian wartime economy. By the time the war had started, approximately 570,000 women worked in Canada industry, mostly participating in packaging jobs. 5 years later, almost 1 million women would be employed, with many working traditionally male factory jobs.
Thank you, Leo. Now on to you, who's going to talk about their voting rights.
Thanks, Yasin. The women are now allowed to vote. They weren't always allowed this right. They have been fighting for their rights since the 19th century. One of them was a well-known author, speaker, and feminist, Nellie McClung. Picture right here. In fact, in 1914 and 1915, she campaigned on the behalf of the Liberal Party for women's right to vote. She also helped organize a Women's Political Equality League, a group devoted to women's suffrage. Once the war started, women started replacing men in factories, banks, and offices. And as their roles expanded, women wanted to use their new economical advantage to push for their political rights. In 1916, Manitoba became the first province to grant women the right to vote. And in 1917, Prime Minister Borden passed a bill known as the Wartime Elections Act, giving the vote to women whose male relatives were serving in the First World War. Even though this was a desperate attempt to get votes, it did grant women their deserved right to vote. But in Quebec, even though women won the right to vote in federal elections, they didn't actually get electoral rights until 22 years later, meaning that they could vote for the Prime Minister, but not the mayor or any provincial candidate. Because of this, women founded the Provincial Committee for Women's Suffrage in 1922, and after 18 hard-fought years, Bill 18 granted them the right to vote on April 25, 1940.
Thank you, Yug. Now on to John, who's going to talk about their wages.
Another key issue relating to women before World War I were their wages compared to men. At the start of the 20th century, the factories replaced families as the main productive unit. Factory work involved long hours, low wages, and often brutal working conditions. For example, young girls work for 60 hours a week for 80 cents, or less than 2 cents per hour. In 1911, women comprised 13% of the total labor force and the female labor force participation rate. whereas young men work for 50 hours a week for 120 cents and they comprise 87% of the total labor force. But during the war, most men went to the front lines, so women replaced men that joined the army. Since the demand for jobs in factories to create ammunition, aircraft, ships, and etc. highly increased, mass amounts of women started to fill these roles with improved wages. During the war, women were making 58% of what men were making, a 6% increase from 1912.
Thank you, Pedro. Now, do you think the women's rights and jobs changed after the war?
No, now, if we're talking about rights, I would say that nothing changed significantly before the war and after the war. They went back to square one. Their life depended on men and their money. They couldn't find jobs that easily, but miraculously, they could find a job. Their wages would be extremely ridiculous compared to the cost of living they needed to take. And that's what leads us to the 1920s. 2 years past the war, and the women are still fighting to be enrolled in a work position and for a better salary. The most common profession, if we're talking about women and rights in the workforce, it's teaching. But analyzing it, we can see that nothing changed. Wages remained static while the cost of living nearly doubled. Teachers have to obey an amount of ridiculous rules, such as not having any relationships with men, not smoking cigarettes, having dresses to their ankles, and having a life totally devoted to the school. Now, if you think about the last one, that's their job, and they need to be devoted. But if you compare them with a normal lifestyle the men take, teachers work more hours and still earn less than half. So if you ask me, nothing significant has changed. The women have the right to work, if there's any work available for them. But they're not able to survive in our society without someone sustaining them, since the living costs have doubled. And they get $2 a week. In a way, they saved their country. And unfortunately, they were backstabbed by the government. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, on to Yug now. So Yug, how did World War I change how women were treated?
Well, World War I changed the way women were treated in a big way. The course of not only the use of women, but also the rights of women changed dramatically over the time period of World War I. Not only were they finally given the opportunities in the workplace, but they also obtained the right to vote. Now, over 100 years later, women are allowed to vote freely and are given the same rights as men. People like Nellie McClung and the Famous Five advocated for the suffrage of women and shaped it into what it is today. That's all from me. Now back to you, Yasin.
Thank you, Yug. All right, now on to Leo. So Leo, back then, what were people's beliefs on women getting new jobs that they would have never got before?
Initially, there was a disbelief on the idea to allow women into new fields of employment. As the war continued, however, it became clear that if the country was to proceed to make most of the resources, women contributions would be key. Many new factories were created to manufacture guns, ammunition, aircraft, ships, and more. And women soon could be seen in almost every factory, working alongside with their male counterparts. The change in gender roles took some time getting used to, but by the end of the war, women had more than proved themselves to the country and to the men that they could do any job that a man could, and do it well. But eventually, these efforts didn't prove to be enough, as most of the women in the factories lost their jobs. Thank you, Yasin.
Thank you, Leo. Okay, on to you, John. So do you think women's wages change as much as their voting rights or their employment?
Even though the presence of World War I changed women's salaries and wages, I do not think it changed much as the voting rights and the industries and the jobs.
Thank you, John.
No problem.
Thank you, Pedro. Now on to Leo, who's going to talk about industry.
To men. At the start of the 21st century, the factories replaced 21st. The 20th?
20th century, right? One of them was a well-known author, speaker, and feminist. Giving the vote to women whose males